For those who weren't there yesterday, my name is Enrique. I'm a PhD student in the University of São Paulo, and I'm gonna have the huge pleasure to chair this table. This time we're gonna talk about financial regulation. To my right, we have two of our guests. To the far right, we have right here, who's walking right now. We have Professor Leslie Elliott Armijo, who's an associate professor at the School for International Studies at Simon Fraser University. She has been publishing about BRICS and financial statecraft, and she came all the way from Canada here, so thank you a lot for that. Next, we have Professor Daniela Prates, who's an associate professor at the Institute of Economics of the University of Campinas and a researcher at the Brazilian National Council for Scientific and Technological Development. She's also the editor-in-chief of the Brazilian journal Economia e Sociedade and an associate researcher at the Latin American Institute of the Freie Universität Berlin. And finally, we have Professor Mario Shapiro, who's a professor here. He's also the vice dean of the academic and now doctoral program of in law and economic development. He was a visiting scholar at Columbia Law School, at King's College, and in New York University. He was also a lecturer in GLP at Harvard and a visiting fellow at IPEA. And he has a master's as well as a PhD from the University of São Paulo. So like all the other tables, everyone's going to have 20 minutes, and we're going to be super strict because we're on a tight schedule. And we can start with Leslie.
Okay. Is this on?
Yeah.
Yes, and I need the slide. Okay, fine, yeah. Okay. Yeah, good. Actually, this will work. So you saw my little advertisement. Anybody wants to take a look afterwards? This is my other hat. This is international political economy. Today I'm going to talk about comparative. Where's the? Okay. So theorizing patient. Do I need this? It's theorizing patient capital in emerging economies. The research. I'm going to do like this so I can read it. The research question is, what are the options available to a national policymaker or policymakers in an emerging economy who wants to expand patient capital or long-term financing for infrastructure in particular or long-term investment? That's a big problem for lots of national policymakers. There's some examples. Okay, and a lot of the theory I'm going to present is kind of very simplistic economic stuff, political economy assumptions, but I want to be clear that I assume, unlike rational choice, hard rational choice theories, that policymakers do want to solve problems. Okay, so we're assuming policymakers with goodwill, and they want to govern. Okay, I'm not in this book, and this is a quick précis of a book. I'm not trying to break new ground theoretically, at least not at this point. But I start by saying, okay, what's out there? What is it that various bodies of theory, particularly ones that are used in places like the World Bank, say about what works, in terms of the financial sector. The unit of analysis here is national financial sector reforms in emerging economies or middle-income countries. So there are various ways to cut it up. You can look at capital markets versus banks, blah, blah, blah. I say, okay, what has interesting political economy implications? I use two dimensions here then. The source of long-term savings, whose owners are willing to invest for a decade or more, and who has the task of allocating these savings to investment projects. So then you get, political science love this, fourfold table. Source of savings, national or foreign. That's your basic choices. According to sort of basic, simple economic theory, what are you going to get if you use national savings? Well, and political theory. The supply is responsive, at least in principle, to public policy. You can raise taxes, you can grab various sources of forced savings and allocate them to this or that. You can set up incentives. Another benefit is you don't build up foreign exchange obligations. You don't have foreign debt. On the other hand, the cost of relying on national savings is limited, especially if you are a poorer country, and especially if you are a country where a lot of the savings are held outside the financial system. They're held overseas, they're held in gold, they're put in real estate. Okay, well, you can rely on foreign savings then. What are the benefits? Well, the supply is potentially large. You may have seen a couple years ago, the World Bank, IMF, and 9 other development banks came out with this manifesto saying, look, if we set up public-private partnerships, we can leverage billions of dollars into trillions of dollars by having the public sector create structured investment vehicles, and then all these private investors will come. Of course, the problem with foreign capital is the supply is volatile, and it responds to exogenous factors that are not under the control of the government. So you can't really rely on it, and moreover, you have foreign exchange obligations. The second dimension that I look at is who gets to allocate the investment. And here, the basic idea, again, very simple stuff. The public sector or the private sector. What are supposed to be the benefits of the public sector? Well, it's better at providing public goods. If your social return is anticipated to be higher than the private returns, you're not going to get private investors to do it. The state has to do it. If you're thinking about things like infrastructure, you probably want, they're mostly public goods, or at least partially. Moreover, there's policy space for government. Government can do long-term industrial strategy, crisis management, etc. It's got some tools. On the other hand, it's probably less efficient. You don't have the same kind of incentives for public managers as people who are working in the private sector with their own money. There may be more waste. Moreover, fiscal deficits. You're likely to not be able to find all the money to do all the things you want. And corruption, and by the way, I edited my slide to say my definition of corruption is corruption of public officials. The use by public officials of public resources for private gain. Private sector. I hope somebody's going to give me 10-minute, 5-minute. Okay, all right, thank you. Private sector, well, it's probably more efficient. And the risks are borne by private actors. So at least in theory, it's not going to give you fiscal deficits and problems there. On the other hand, inferior provision of public goods, why are they going to do it? They're not going to do it unless you pay them or subsidize them. And the investment is likely to be pro-cyclical. So when there's a crisis, so then you get 4 ideal types of potentially patient capital. National public finance would be, classically national development banks and other forms of public finance of long-term projects. National private finance, private commercial and investment banks, and capital markets. Foreign public, now this is interesting. Most people don't compare these all 4 together. That's, I think, the theoretical advance here. Foreign aid, foreign loans from state banks, FDI from state banks, and international financial institutions. The multilaterals, which are, of course, state banks collective. And foreign private then is everything, you know, from bank loans to FDI to bonds and portfolio investment and so on and so forth. Okay. So then the research design is to write what I call analytical policy histories, which is a low-tech word for historical institutionalism, of intentional national government programs, that is policies, changes of law and administrative policies to expand long-term finance in the era of financial globalization, approximately 1990 to the present, so more or less 3 decades. I look at 4 emerging economies or middle-income countries, and the question is, you know, did the actual experiences seem to go along with these theoretical expectations, and to the extent that they do or don't, why? You know, what can we learn from case studies? So the national, by the way, the choice here is I like to look at large countries because they're less influenced by the international environment. They have a bit more, intrinsically a bit more policy space. And I am not saying that a choice of a country means that whatever category I put it in, that it's their major form of finance. I'm saying that in this period, it was the subject of intentional policy promotion. For example, anyone who knows anything about India would say, national private finance? What? India's totally state bank dominated. Yes, that's true. But since 1990, there have been a series of pushes for increasing the space for private banks and capital markets. Okay, so public finance, Brazil and the Bangladesh, private finance, India, bank and capital markets reforms, foreign public finance, Pakistan. For a long time, Pakistan relied on aid from the West, which goes up and down and up and down. And more recently, it has been the jewel in the crown, illusion, intentional, of China's Belt and Road Initiative, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. Okay, oh great, I'm doing fine. And foreign private finance is poor Argentina and the convertibility law since 1990. Okay, so all that I've put, I was really, you know, I may actually have time to talk about the cases. I wasn't sure I was going to have much time. I've been rushing. So then the expectations for national public finance are just to kind of put the 2 dimensions together. Funds public goods, more policy space for government, avoids foreign exchange debt, but you may waste resources, you may get fiscal deficits, and you may get corruption of public officials. And the expectation for national private finance, same deal, benefits, it's probably efficient in the sense of use, what was that, 5? Okay, use of funds, you know, you get financial deepening, which maybe the World Bank has backed off a little bit from, but it was, you know, the more the better, the more finance the better, the more diversified the better, as in the Anglo-American model. This was more popular before the global financial crisis, avoids foreign exchange debt, but underfunds public goods, blah, blah, blah. And I didn't say it before, but likely, you know, there's a lot of theory that says if more of your finance goes through the capital markets, you may get more inequality because who's investing, it's never more than the top 10 or maybe 20%, and they're obviously not going to do it unless they get returns. Joseph Stiglitz gave a speech to the World Economics Association a couple of years ago where he you know, cited a bunch of research making that point. Foreign public, blah, 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 supplements scarce capital, funds public goods, cements strategic partnership, which may be a political goal of the government, but you may get white elephants that you didn't really want. That has happened to a number of people working with China in the Belt and Roads. You get debt. Even if you have FDI, you got various kinds of foreign exchange denominated obligations, corruption, external vulnerability, and finally foreign private, you know, working everything through. Okay, so I haven't given you even one slide each on the case studies. Of course, that's the real value added here. But let me give you like 1 minute each. I mean, on the whole, I think this sort of real simplistic theory is not bad at telling you what some of the issues are in these cases. In Brazil, with national public finance, but especially the National Development Bank, I think the benefits have largely been realized. But, of course, this does require a reasonably competent state. You know, the BNDES has been around since the 50s, and for all the trauma that Brazil is going through now, Brazil has a reasonably competent state. The costs have also been there. I mean, clearly there's a whole debate about fiscal deficits and the contribution of the BNDES to them and so on and so forth. I would note that, at least so far, and I hope it stays that way, the BNDES itself hasn't been implicated in corruption, but clearly there's a huge corruption scandal going on that involves public officials and a lot of the major recipients of BNDES, excuse me, financing over the last 15, 20 years. India, well, I mean, the jury's still out, but my reading of the evidence is that the benefits are partly realized in the sense that there is more finance around for good companies. It almost seems as though bank privatization, what Indians call bank privatization, is actually just allowing public banks to have competition from private banks. It's not even selling them, it's just allowing private banks to enter. That actually has raised the amount of finance quite a bit. The costs are quite apparent. There have been, you know, recurrent capital markets crises. India's working through a huge one right now. And in fact, a lot of fiscal hits from trying to liberalize private finance. On the other hand, India has been really strict about trying to keep it to national finance. They don't always succeed, but they try. And that's been quite interesting. Pakistan and foreign public finance, well, you know, the economic benefits aren't all that clear. It's not clear that, you know, the project doesn't benefit China more than Pakistan. On the other hand, Pakistani government has political goals as well as economic goals, and it may be that it's made a conscious choice to prioritize those. You know, that helps balance India if you've got China in your corner. The costs are still vague, but quite possibly large on the economic side particularly. Argentina, I'm sure most people in this room are familiar with the case of Argentina. Coitada. I mean, it's true, okay? You got to give the convertibility law, which was established a currency board, which made a one-to-one relationship between the dollar and the Argentine peso in 1991. It did end hyperinflation. We forget that. Okay, that is non-trivial. But there was growth for a few years. It was, you know, kept this rigid exchange rate way too long. And gosh, it's now been almost 2 decades since the end of that, in a huge crash in 2001, early 2002, and Argentina is still suffering the effects of relying on foreign capital inflows to support the currency board and to buy up state-owned enterprises and supposedly run them well. And, you know, my judgment then at the end of all this, and as I said, I'm still working it through and still writing it up, is that, you know, for all the problems, if you have a reasonably competent state, maybe a push for more national public finance is not a bad idea.
Good morning. I would like to thank Mario and Diogo for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. And I think my presentation has some relationship with Leslie, so I think it would be nice to, it's another topic, but with relationship. Then this presentation is based on two papers I wrote on financial regulation in Brazil, one with Barbara Fritz, and that I call a broad approach to financial regulation in emerging economies. The aim of the papers and the presentation is to contribute to the debate on financial regulation brought about by the global financial crisis. But especially with regards to emerging economies, this debate is far from consolidated, both in theoretical terms and with regard to economic policy recommendations. But what happened after the capital flow boom of 2010, 2011, that followed the global financial crisis and was related with the quantitative easing policies, at the time that Guido Manteg mentioned, brought about the currency war, the discussion on currency war, this debate lost momentum. But emerging economies still face the same problems, and because these economies that I will detail are always vulnerable to the capital flows booms, to the boom burst booms. So the issue of financial regulation is still very relevant. But how to approach, assess this problem? My starting point is a post-Keynesian approach that is based on two ideas. One key idea of Keynes, that Keynes developed mainly in the general theory, that is that the whole of state goes beyond the economic policy. So the state should regulate the private agents' wealth accumulation of assets. So the state should regulate the field where private agents accumulate wealth. So a crucial issue is the choice between real productive investment and financial assets. So but the emphasis of Keynes was only on the asset dimension of private agents' portfolio. But then the other key idea is an idea developed by Minsky, the higher Minsky, that is a very important post-Keynesian. And Minsky emphasized the liability side of the portfolio, because all accumulation of private wealth depends on liabilities. Agents need to get indebted to accumulate wealth. Then the state should regulate both the liability side and asset side of private agents' portfolio. So this is a justification of the financial regulation from a post-Keynesian perspective. So it's really an economic discussion, but I think it's useful for lawyers and the debate here, because the other justification is from more a mainstream approach that rely on the asymmetrical information, the market failures. And from a post-Keynesian approach, didn't exist a market failure. The market functions as Minsky and Keynes emphasize. The boom burst feature of the financial cycle is a feature of the capitalist economy. It's not a market failure. So this is an important point for us. But with regards to emerging economies, that is the focus here, in the current international monetary and financial system, we have, don't have time to develop here, this is another topic of my research agenda. This feature the system is featured by what we call a currency hierarchy. That is also an idea brought about by Keynes, mainly in the Bretton Woods Conference. I don't know if you know that Keynes has a proposal for the reform of international monetary system of Bretton Woods that failed because the American proposal that was successful. But my focus is the current system. In the current system featured by financial globalization, emerging economies are, I use a definition of emerging economies as the peripheral economies that have engaged in the financial globalization. The currencies of these economies are positioned at the lower level of the currency hierarchy. At the top level is the US dollar, the key currency. So these economies are the more vulnerable, as I already mentioned, to these volatile capital flows and to the so-called original sin. So they couldn't get adapted at the international level in their own currencies. So this result in one of the main problems that Brazil and other emerging economies face, that is the currency mismatch. And the other problem is the lower policy space related exactly to the lower liquidity premium of these currencies. Because of that, in the case of these economies, the state should regulate both residents and non-residents and foreign and domestic currencies positions. Because of that the traditional division in the economic literature, what happened? We have some scholars that research on domestic financial regulation and others on external financial regulation. What I'm proposing here, that nowadays in this the currency system, is impossible to make this division. We need to analyze together both the domestic and the external financial regulation. Even because it's not even possible to separate the domestic financial system from capital flows. Then I will detail for reach all these agents and positions, emerging economies, government need to use many regulation tools. So need to use what we call the prudential regulation, the capital flows, and what I call the foreign exchange derivatives regulation. So this is, for example, very important for Brazil and South Korea. Because of that, the proposal of the IMF that the capital controls should be used only in their last resort is impossible, because, as I will show, there are some kinds of flows that the prudential regulation that would be the preferable option for in the IMF abroad doesn't reach some agents and some positions. So this is why I call a broad approach. But this approach should also be tailored for each emerging economy, depend on the features of the capital flows, the institutionality of the financial market, and the goals of the financial regulation, the goals, the choice of the policymakers. And what happened? Well, okay. So it's important to present the goals of financial regulation. Okay. I think that we have three main goals in the case of emerging economies, but I think also of center of developed economies. The curb reduce financial risks. And these financial risks are related with what I mentioned, the dependence of capital flows, currency mismatch. But also with even credit booms, domestic credit booms. The other goal is increase policy space. So the financial regulation is also key to increase the policy space in these countries. And the third goal is foster capital accumulation. And to foster capital accumulation, we need the mechanism of finance and funding. So finance, what Keynes called the short-term capital that corporation needs to launch an investment. And funding is how to consolidate this investment with long-term savings. That's what Leslie was approaching. But other important things that I think that the literature doesn't emphasize is that we have important feedbacks among these three aims. So, for example, in the case of Brazil, for example, after the global financial crisis, the currency appreciated. And so the appreciation could also have a negative effect on export corporations' profits, and this could also affect capital accumulation and even increase the financial risk, for instance, currency mismatch. So we have these three goals. They are intertwined. So this is, I think, an important idea. Then, what I propose is this that I call a financial regulation toolkit. So we have the three kinds of regulation, and I will show which kind of flows of agents that each kind of regulation reach. So we have prudential regulation, the foreign exchange derivatives regulations, and capital flows. Here I divided two different kind of capital flows, the portfolio and the FDI and foreign loans. Only after detail the toolkit, only to remember or to summarize what are these three kinds of regulations. So the prudential financial regulation affect the asset and the liability only of financial institutions. So this is very important. This kind of regulation doesn't reach, for example, capital flows, investment in the equity market in Brazil. Okay, so only reach financial institutions. What depends, varies among countries. For example, Brazil is not only banks that are reached by financial regulation. We have also other non-bank financial institutions, but there are some countries that only some kinds of financial institutions that are reached by financial regulation. And we have many kinds of financial regulations. The most famous one is related with the Basel Agreement, the capital adequacy ratios, but we could have also, and it's very important in the case of emerging economies, for example, restrictions on indebtedness in foreign currencies, for example. So who could have this some specific prudential regulation related with foreign currencies positions. Capital controls, this is a controversial, there are different definitions. For example, the OECD and the IMF use a juridical definitions that classify capital controls as only the ones that discriminated between non-resident and resident, but here I use more broad definition as capital controls regulation that affect managed cross-border flows. So all regulations that manage cross-border flows are capital controls. And these controls could also be quantitative or qualitative. Tax-based, for example, is a quantitative control, and target different kinds of flows. In Brazil, we have a huge, important experience with capital controls, but is not the aim of the presentation. And the foreign exchange derivative regulation is the regulation that reach positions in foreign exchange derivatives. Why is this important? For example, in the case of Brazil, the most part of the derivatives, foreign exchange derivatives, are traded in the exchanges. Is what we call the organized market. And so in this case, the prudential regulation doesn't reach these operations because the banks are always the counterpart of the foreign exchange derivatives operations at the over-the-counter market. At the exchange, a non-resident investors could have a position, for example, Brazil, and this is not reached by prudential regulation that only reached financial institutions. And capital controls are also not efficient because this, for a non-resident to make a position in foreign exchange derivatives in Brazil, they need only a very low percentage of the whole position because this feature of financial derivatives. And then we need, so all these kind of regulations too, to reach all agents and markets to reach the three aims of the financial regulation in emerging market economies. So, for example, prudential regulation only reach financial institutions and resident agents, and in this case, spot and derivatives positions in the case of financial institutions. But to regulate derivatives positions in the organized market by non-resident, for example, or non-financial institutions, we need the foreign exchange derivative regulation that reach only derivatives. That is contracts for forward settlement. And capital controls depends on the kind of capital controls reach both financial and non-financial and non-residents, only non-residents and only at the spot market. So is why I'm supporting that we need all this kind of regulation and not use the IMF approach of hierarchy of measures of tools. Thank you.
Okay. Hi, good morning, everyone. I'm delighted to share. I'm glad to share with you some of these ideas, and it will be a pleasure to have your reaction to them. This is still a work in progress, so I'll be delighted to hear from you. This is a paper on the relationship between global rules on banking regulation and local interests. For those who are not familiar with this debate, there are global standards established in Basel agreements that shape banking regulation around the world. So when I mention here Basel standards, I refer to two main issues. The first one are the rules on capital adequacy that stipulates a ratio between banks' capital and banks' assets, and this ratio must be above 80%. So basically, Basel is an agreement that limits banking leverage. In addition to the rules of capital adequacy, Basel also means, in this presentation, the principles for effective banking regulation, which promotes, among others, the independence of financial authorities, such as central banks. In the domestic dimension, independent central bank and regulatory states are, I'm sorry. In the domestic dimension, the independent central bank and the regulatory state are the flip sides of the global capital rules. Precisely, the local mirror of global rules is a sort of regulatory state that most depoliticize the financial regulation. But indifferently, this is a sort of regulatory state that has a narrow focus on financial stability rather than a broader focus that combines stability and elasticity. So by stipulating limits on capital adequacy and promoting the narrow focus of central banks, the Basel political economy imposes limits on the local arrangements. So this paper aims at investigating how developing countries conciliate the global rules, the Basel standards, and the local interests in Latin America. Latin Americans are interesting case studies because they have experienced two simultaneous transformations in the last decades, which are, first, the economic globalization and also the political democratization. This is the case of Argentina in the 80s, the Brazil in 88, the Chile in the end of 80s. It's not exactly the case of Mexico, but it happened all over the place, the redemocratization of these countries simultaneous to the economic globalization. And on the other hand, globalization pushes these countries to converge toward global standards, like the Basel rules. But on the other hand, democratization empowers local interests to shape local policies. So the question here is, how do these countries conciliate both games? In terms of literature, in a broader analysis, Danny Roderick emphasizes how global governance has instilled a sort of trade-off between national sovereignty and mass democracy. Roderick, to be precise, Roderick mentions a sort of trilemma in which you have the hyperglobalization, national sovereignty, and mass democracy. So if you keep the hyperglobalization, you have to choose between national sovereignty or mass democracy. According to this view, in the hyperglobalization, countries have no choice but pick only one of these two possibilities, designing their own regulatory institutions or building democratically responsive institutions. Those who defy, according to this view, those who defy the global political economy would be severely punished via regulatory arbitrage, thus suffering from capital flight, among other effects. However, notwithstanding this global straitjacket and the national diffusion of regulatory states with a narrow focus, the recent literature have been showing that the implementation of Basel standards and the institutional design of regulatory states are very country-specific and mutable over time. First, the new wave of literature on regulatory state has claimed that in the global south, regulatory states combines regulatory insulation with dirigist characteristics. This is the case of Brown and Morgan in Australia and or Jayasuriya also from Australia, and even the case of David Levy-Faur, who was initially a very enthusiastic guy in favor of very narrow regulatory state, and now in more recent publication, Levy-Faur has considered that the regulatory state has a polymorphic constitution. But indifferently, all these authors claim that in several developing countries, the politically autonomous regulatory state overlaps with the politically embedded developmental state. Second, literature on Basel standards have showed that these rules admit different possibilities of compliance and imply high state capacity to be enforced. Accordingly, countries might enforce them strictly, in other words, transplanting them substantively, or countries might comply with Basel rules only formally. This is the case, for instance, of mock compliance, described by Andrew Walter for the East Asian countries. By the same token, Emily Jones from Oxford brings comparative studies indicating that in developing countries have institutional limits to fully enforce Basel standards or Basel rules. Bearing that in mind, this paper builds an analytical model to analyze how Latin Americans conciliate Basel standards and local interests. The model has three variables. The first one is the type of legal enforcement. The second one is the degree of global delegation to international decision makers, the extent to which these countries are globalized or not. And finally, the degree of local regulation embeddedness. And in this axis, I compare if the regulation is narrow or more embedded, more broader, is broader to other purposes rather than financial instability. So, regarding law, it is well established in the legal scholarship that the contrast between law in books and law in action. Due to different enforcement capacities, law might have only a face value, or it can play a real game, can be very effective. International legal scholars, such as Annie Marie Slaughter and others, are particularly aware of this condition and have been differentiating between formal and substantive compliance with international norms. Drawing on these categories, the analytical model foresees three possibilities of regulatory convergence in legal terms. The first one is the substantive convergence. In this case, the Congress or the Parliament enacts a law that explicitly delegates regulatory powers to central bank to enforce the Basel rules, and the central banks accomplish it effectively. The second possibility is the functional convergence. In this vein, there is no explicit Congress delegation in law, but the financial bureaucracy enforces Basel rules discretionarily, but effectively. The third type is the formal convergence. In this track, Basel rules stay only in the formal dimension, only in the law in the books, but they are not effectively enforced. As for this is the first element of this model. The second element of this model is the degree of global delegation to international decision making. The diversity of national regulatory arrangements here can be conceived in a global-local axis, which measures the degree of local control over domestic regulatory designs. Countries might delegate more power to international bodies, like Basel, or they can hold some decision-making in the domestic arena. Concretely, in the case of Basel standards, countries might follow the rules strictly, or they can adapt them to local situations. This is the case, for instance, the case of Japan, who interpreted the Basel standards, applying those limits of 80%, converting the 80% in 4% because Japan considered all the national banks only local banks. So Japan was able to use a sort of loophole in the Basel standards and creating some very local adaptations of these global standards. So Japan, in this case, maintains some of this Basel standards in the local, more in local dimension than in the global dimension. Finally, as for local constituents, the third part of this model is the diversity of regulatory regimes in the domestic environment, and it can be conceived in an insulated embedded axis, which measures the degree to which regulatory design is embedded in local polities. The research assumes that regardless the extent to which financial authorities are global dependent, or regardless the other axis, the global-local axis, the countries might play a concise or an ample role in the financial sector. So we can have, theoretically, you can have a following global standards with a very embedded financial authority. So you can have an authority which is devoted to combine stability and elasticity, and at the same time trying to conciliate that with the global standards. This is not a very typical ideal case, because this is a more Bretton Woods case. Meanwhile, the very global with autonomy combination is a more hyper-globalization kind, but there are these theoretical possibilities. So the embedded designs are those ones in which authorities pursue a broad goal, which includes financial stability and other purposes, such as employment, development, and growth. And the insulated arrangements, in turn, are those that are devoted only to protecting financial stability. This is a very work in progress paper, so I'm the beginning of the research, but I have some partial findings here. Brazil and Chile provide a good contrast in this regard. Chile reformed its central bank in 1989 in order to narrow its mandate from the former quotation, encourage the orderly and progressive development of national economy, decree law passed in 53, to the later quotation, look after the stability of the currency, a law passed in 89. In addition, Chile enacted a law to specifically enforce Basel standards. Meanwhile, Brazil preserved its legal framework enacted in 64 that assigns an ample mandate to the monetary authority, which includes inflation control, financial stability, but also promotion of development. Moreover, until recently, Brazilian state-owned banks played a crucial role in the economy, which enabled the government to have substantial political power over the markets. In parallel, however, the Brazilian central bank also meets the requirement of global regulatory capitalism, such as it has operational autonomy to pursue an inflation target, and it vigorously implements Basel standards for banking supervision. Just to mention that while Basel agreement requires 80% of capital and asset ratio, Brazilian central bank imposes 11%, and the Brazilian banks delivers 15%. 1-5. But different from Chile, Brazil implements Basel rules without any specific law. All the Basel operational implementation is under the broad mandate of central bank, so it's completely discretionary in Brazilian reality. So it seems to me that while Chile moved away toward a full regulatory convergence, Brazil tried a more conciliatory condition via functional or inaction convergence without a specific law, the functional convergence that I mentioned before. The implication seems to be obvious. Both choices have their particular cost and benefits. On the one side, Chile has been able to craft a financial regulation that is law-based, and accordingly it's more institutionalized. However, Chile has abandoned industrial policy or credit-directed policies. Brazil, in turn, chose to appease different interest groups simultaneously and craft different sectoral policies. The cost of that was to keep financial regulation in the discretionary level. In other words, the juxtaposition of global rules and developmental states in Brazil takes at the bureaucratic level. So Brazilian arrangement is more politically vulnerable. Neither the developmental state nor the independent central bank are shielded from the political turn. From now, we will have a stress test of this model in Brazil. So, as I told you in the beginning, this is a very work in progress, and I will bring in the next step of this research is to go deeper in these case studies of Brazil and and Chile, and I will also bring Mexico and Argentina to this comparison. So the full project is a comparison between Brazil, Chile, Mexico, and Argentina, which are the biggest countries in the region. I also like the largest countries, as you. So I'm going to compare that because this is very lucky because Emily Jones, who has a very interesting work comparing basic standards in developing countries, is very interested in low-income developing countries, in smaller developing countries. So this is, I'm very lucky. So finally, I couldn't finish this presentation without honoring this important Brazilian sociologist, who is Chico de Oliveira. Chico passed away last month. He wrote extensively about Brazilian development, and his major contribution was to reject those models that sustained a sort of dualism in developing countries. Chico claimed that underdevelopment is about the mutual and dialectical reinforcement between the forwardness and the backwardness, like the combination of the sophisticated global economy and very cheap labor force. One of his last works, published in 2004, is a book called The Platypus, this very beautiful animal that you have here. According to Chico, according to him, the Brazilian economy resembles a platypus because it has a truncated evolution. As platypus, Brazilian economy lays eggs, but has a sophisticated bloody circulation in the financial system. By coincidence, I'm living in Brazil and I'm going to Australia for a while, which is the country of a platypus. And my purpose there is not to understand this beautiful animal, but to carry on the Chico's agenda. Precisely, I intend to learn how other countries, particularly the Asian ones, have been able to reconcile different driving forces that underpin the developing world in a better shape than the platypus of Latin America. So, thank you.
So now for questions.
Thank you. Thank you so much for our presentations. They were very, very interesting. I have two questions, one for Mario, another one for Daniela. Mario, I just want to question, I have a question related to your choice of countries, because you are concerned with the biggest emerging countries in Latin America, but Brazil and Argentina, they are members of the Basel Committee. So they could have a particular influence in the formation of the international rules related to banking supervision. So how you are going to differentiate these countries and their behavior and the impact of this particular feature compared to Chile or other countries in Latin America are going to look in terms of adoption. So that's different compared to what Emily Jones is doing. So she's concerned with countries without participation in the Basel Committee. And Daniela, just to provoke a little bit, are you going to identify Brazil maybe as an outlier among the emerging economies? And I'm particularly talking about the Brazil and its position in relation to the convertibility of the real. Brazil asked to adhere to the OECD Codes of Liberalization of Capitals in 2017. OECD agreed last year, and now they started the process to adhere to the codes. And this means that Brazil is going to change capital controls and all the apparatus, the institutional apparatus created by Getúlio Vargas in the 30s. So it's going to be a big change. So it's not a coincidence that Campos Neto is talking about this issue now, because OECD is going to take a decision this year in relation to the adherence of the codes. So how you would see the Brazil now among these emerging economies? Thank you.
I have a question for Leslie. I'm wondering if you could expand a little bit more of what exactly you mean about the effectiveness of the state, if you're looking just for the technical dimension on provision of capital, because the political economy of the time in Brazil actually equates corruption with state ineffectiveness, which I disagree, but it's on people's mind, and it's what's happening on the ground in terms of reform, the retreat of the state and of state-led policies, or either rules that push them to the direction of, private law and private corporations. So you're saying something different. You're saying that your benefit, when you put something as a benefit and then the cost would be something different, you're saying that the state is effective despite corruption. It's being a little bit provocative here. So I would like to hear more on how would you react to that basic criticism.
So even though I don't work on currency and banking issues, I've been thinking a lot about capital controls because of this issue of policy experimentation in space, right? And I think this overlaps in a lot of different areas. And coming from the East Asian sort of example, one of the things I'm curious about is I know sort of the IMF demonization of capital controls, right? And one of the things that's come up in Europe and North America is like people have been arguing that we should make an argument for invigorating capital controls as one way of sort of like channeling populist energy towards like ideas of economic nationalism, right? Like quite seriously. And so one of the things, again, coming from East Asia, given the different case examples you're showing, like when I hear people criticize Brazil, there's always this like counterfactuals, like Brazil's done okay, but it could have done better, right? So what's the actual like case study, the empirical case for the country that like too aggressively pursued capital controls and then had sort of like a disastrous sort of like consequence? Because I never actually see that. I always see like this country pursued like Brazil, like national public finance, and it could have done better, right, as sort of like a theoretical argument, but never like an empirical case study. I see lots like Argentina where like, you open yourself up to international finance and then bad things happen. And then people say like, well, you should have just done it better. But I never see that particular case study of like, what's the basis empirically beyond sort of like theoretical models of capital controls being justified as being so demonized as part of the policy toolkit, where like people should be like wary of really like promoting capital controls in the current, and taking sort of the opportunity to promote them as a form of economic nationalism.
Okay, so, thanks for the question. Remember, this is a study of 30 years, okay? So I'm not just talking about the last 4 years in Brazil. I'm trying to say, how does this case over these 30 years, and in, with some, you always have to introduce your study. I think on the whole, despite all the agony, Brazil's going to come out. I'm still hopeful. I mean, look, my country's president is at least as bad as yours and has more opportunity to do damage. Okay, so I think, though, that with state capacity is not just technical efficiency, but a certain amount, it's a development. Brazil does have a developmental state, despite Lava Jato and blah, 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 and all the agony. A lot of the state still works. As I said, so far, knock on wood, the National Development Bank is not directly implicated in any of the scandals, although a lot of the firms that it chose to promote have been. So I mean a broad definition of state capacity, whereas there are states that probably should not establish national development banks because they will just be a source of huge waste and loan to the president's or prime minister's friends. I'm going to have to ask you, Jed, about this debate about promoting capital controls for the U.S. I mean, that sounds kind of crazy because, one, it's never going to pass. But, I mean, what is the U.S.'s comparative advantage these days? More and more, it's financial services. I mean, the U.S. lost its trade surplus in the early 70s, its surplus on current account in the early 80s, and its net capital surplus in the world in the early 90s, and it still manages to be the global financial system only because it serves as a market. I actually have a different paper on that, but I'll share it with anyone interested. I mean, it's about different types of financial power that countries have. The U.S. no longer has creditor power. Obviously, China does. But the U.S. still has currency power and financial market power, and they use it as power. This is more the IPE stuff. Anyway, I'm interested. I can't imagine how that would play out.
I can just say, I mean, it's for people, when you talk about like, it would never pass, right? Well, this is the contemporary moment. People want to definancialize the American economy for a variety of reasons, right? So yes, that is the current model overlap, but people find it to be deeply problematic, right? And so if you want to definancialize the economy, you have to have capital controls. And it would have some sort of short-term pain, but if you have all these sort of wide-ranging ways in which people want to reformat the economy, that's the only possibility. Because unless you institute capital controls and you have a hyper-financialized economy, your policy space is super small for doing the types of things that people now are talking about as being real possibilities for reform.
Despite my general agreement with sorry. Despite my general agreement with the idea of managing international capital flows, I suspect the United States is really a special case. It could have all kinds of knock-on effects. So, you know, be careful what you wish for. That would be my thought.
Then I will answer you first and only comment. I think that this discussion of capital controls in the United States or emerging economies is related with the currency hierarchy. Because as the US is the issuer of the key currency, the US has the highest, greatest policy space. Then the logic of a capital control in the West, from my point of view, would be to control all outflows, not of inflows. As Keynes argued and supported that capital controls should be cooperative. So both from the center who provide the capital and for the recipient countries, because only with this at the source and at the end of the source countries and of the recipient countries that the capital controls would be effective. In this discussion, for example, the IMF, one of the papers of the IMF during these last papers on capital controls supported in the face of the quantitative easing that the advanced countries should adopt also controls on outflows. So from my point of view, the problem is different between center countries and the West and the other countries, and also between center and peripheral countries. But in the case of Brazil, the experience of Brazil, the recent experience on regulation of capital flows is really interesting, but it was a short-term experience. So I think that the capital controls are not guilt. We should not guilt the use of capital controls for Brazilian problems, the current Brazilian problems. I think that the problem was that the regulation was adopted too late when the currency had already appreciated and with negative, we see this now, the industrialization. And I think one crucial cause of the Brazilian crisis is the industrialization, related with currency appreciation. And as the regulation was adopted only 2010, and the real was the currency that has the greatest appreciation in 2009. Was totally crazy. And so, and the regulations, all the three regulations was adopted in Brazil, but only until 2012, they started to eliminate, and 2013 is totally over. So I think that the problem was that the adoption too late and the short-term duration of the regulation. Camila, thank you for your question. Recently, I wrote a paper criticizing the proposal of convertibility of real to the Monde Diplomatique in Brazil. And I think that I'm totally against this, exactly because Brazil and the emerging economies has a very low policy space. And Brazil, we are lucky, in my opinion, that we hasn't adhered to enter into OECD yet. Exactly because if we are there, now we enter in OECD, we need to adhere to this code of liberalization. So Brazil would not have anymore the capacity to adopt this broad regulation, financial regulation toolkit. So our policy space will be even smaller. So I think that will happen, that we will have a smaller policy space to adopt financial regulation, because the discussion of policy space usually is more on macroeconomic policy. I think it's crucial, I research on that, the policy space to control interest rate, to control exchange rate, but we are talking about policy space to adopt financial regulation, and with this real convertibility and CDE, and we will be even more with less instrument and in this critical situation.
Okay. Camila, thank you for your question, and thank you also for introducing me, Emily Jones. So it was very helpful. I think you are right. The cases are different. Chile, Mexico, and Brazil are a member of the Basel Committee, but they are, at least in the Brazilian case, I think that the Argentina is as well. They are a member of the committee. They has been a member of the committee since 2009, 2008, since the G20. Okay, so we have Basel I and Basel II formulated without these countries there. This is one important aspect. And even if they are there, Chile is not. So Chile can be a sort of group of control to contrast these experiences. And also, I think that these countries have interesting differences in terms of political economy. So, for instance, Argentina has a more unstable political economic system. I would say, in Argentina, Argentina has more radical shifts than in Brazil. So Argentina came from the Manning rule that made the peso equivalent to dollar, the currency board, to Kirchner attempt to create a developmental state. So Argentina is a very interesting case because they have this kind of radical shift. Brazil is more stabilized, but more informal. Mexico has a very interesting case. Is a very interesting case because until 1990s, Mexico banking system was totally state-owned, and then Mexico privatized the banking system, and this banking system of Mexico became totally foreign control. So I think that all these countries has, they are internationally, they can be compared because 3 of them are member of the G20, so they are in the same level of comparisons, and Chile can be a sort of control group of control. But in that comparisons, internally speaking, they have very interesting differences that can be a very rich to a research. So I think it's, but I think it's a good point. I have to justify better this choice. Okay. Okay. Thank you.